Our next presentation is Total Costs of IT with Barry Mathis, Principal at PYA. As a reminder, this session will have 3 polling questions. Attendees must respond to these polling questions in the allotted time in order to receive CPE credit for the presentation. If you encounter any issues responding to the polls, please send your answer in the questions pane, and we will document them for your CPE credit. Credits will only be earned for sessions attended in their entirety. With that, I'll turn it over to Barry.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I know I'm between you and lunch. If you're virtual and you're having lunch while you're doing this, I envy you. I could use a little myself. As the principal of IT Advisory Consulting, it's my pleasure to present to the forum this afternoon. We're going to be talking about IT cost of ownership. I noticed the topic of the symposium this year is what's hot in healthcare, and this topic comes up quite a bit, and we'll go over kind of when you look at this, when you should be looking at it. There are those that do, those that don't. My experience, to kind of qualify myself here, 30 years in the industry, a lot of those as a CIO, CTO for a large healthcare system down in New Orleans, Ochsner Healthcare System, and even as part of that project, going from our homegrown Ochsner clinical workstations to an Epic implementation, one of the first things we did was a full TCO or TCD, we called it, cost of decision for moving over to Epic for all of those hospitals down there. Have done this. I went back and looked as preparation for this. Out of a couple of hundred full IT assessments, 50 of those have included TCOs or TCDs. We'll talk about what a TCD is. And in those, a lot of those had to do with the situation at hand. And one of the things, never apologize when you're doing a presentation. I get that, but I am going to put a disclaimer out here. You're all different, okay? So if you don't take anything away from this when it comes to a TCO or cost of decision, you're all different. Go through, do your own work. You'll hear me say that a couple of times in here, because there's just a lot of things that can make the difference in how close you are to your actual operating margins within your IT. So let's talk about the agenda real quick. I can get control of the slides here. There we go. We'll start with some things to consider before you jump into a TCO. We'll talk about a new term if you've never heard it. I've been using it for years. I think some others have borrowed it, but it's a TCD. It's a cost of decision, and how it differs a little bit from a cost of ownership. The big pieces of the ownership: capital expenditures, operational expenditures, and costs. And then I get a lot of questions on a regular basis. Barry, in the industry, what do we use for benching? And I'll throw a couple out there, then we'll have a short discussion on benchmarking where you're at with others. And then the best approach strategy. Let's say you're going to do this. I so inspire you that you're going to run out and do a TCO or TCD or hire somebody, or you're in a situation where you need to do this. Then, where do you start? What's the best thing to do? How to go about it? Try to leave you with something that's practical that you can use besides just these credits for your continuing education. So in the beginning, I've listed 3 things here. Again, there's probably 1,000 points of light out there, and I've tried to boil all those down to a 45-minute or so presentation. So there's down to a few dozen. That includes the reasons you do this. Right out of the gate, I can think of 2 more. I'll add those. But out of the gate, if you're already operating and aligning costs to business strategies, knowing what your TCO is and some of the bench metrics associated with it is absolutely necessary, so you can just keep it on the tracks. We're running good. We're running straight. Let's keep it there. The second one is maybe you're not running so good. Maybe it's not so straight. Maybe you've acquired the hospital as part of an acquisition. You're trying to do a flip, all these kind of things. Doing a TCO, part of that it can be extremely helpful in terms of managing or helping with the decisions as you manage the IT operating expenses. Considering replacing an EMR. I get this one more than any. I've done about 170 selection contract negotiations and things for large and small systems, and knowing what that TCO is going into a negotiation can really help the value proposition when you get down to signing a contract. So even though the alignment are traditionally associated with TCO, I'm going to introduce something that's really more related to cost of decision. I'll add 2 more things that aren't, got 1, 2, and 3 here. I'll add 2 more. One is outsourcing, either coming or going, and the other one's mergers, acquisitions, due diligence. This can also be helpful there, but you could teach a whole other master's course on just TCOs related to those type of events. So I boil these down to the most common. But we'll talk about something called total cost of decision. Now, TCD is something that I preach for years and years, probably for the last 20 years. As I talk to people, there's the cost of ownership, which is typically what your capex, your opex, and making. But the cost of decision could be far-reaching. It could have a lot more to do with it, and we'll talk about specifically what those are in advance. Additionally, before you begin, one of the things to keep in mind is it's not just the electronic medical record. I hear that thrown around a lot. What's the cost of my EMR? And if you're truly looking for the cost of just your EMR, it's a different approach, right? We're talking about the cost of ownership for your information technology. In a hospital, we refer to it as a hospital information system, or your total HIS, right? That's everything, not just the EMR. That could be your ERP, your rev cycle, HR, all these kind of things wrapped into the IT. So we're really looking for the cost of ownership for an IT. Often in other circles, seminars, sales calls, all kinds of things, if a CFO asks another professional, especially if that professional is somehow tied to a vendor, they may say, what's the cost? If I were to go from this to this, what's the cost look like? How much is that vendor, how much is Cerner going to cost me? How much is Athena going to cost me? A lot of times what you get back is this number. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've been brought into simply because I get the phone call that says, hey, Barry, I heard you talk about, the top 20 EMRs in the market and where they stand in terms of, contract negotiations, operating cost, capital cost, and all these kind of things. And you said it should be between here and here. I've got a buddy who told me they put it in for this price. Look, I'm up for a bargain just like anybody else, right? So I run towards that bargain and say, who are they talking to? What's going on? Only to find out what was actually quoted was maybe the license fees for that EMR, okay, or just the operating fees for that. And in some cases, the capital left out the professional services for implementation. It left out the interfaces. It left out changes to third-party apps that won't fit. It left out a lot of things that drive that actual number back up to, yep, right within the range that I spoke to when the seminar they saw earlier. So keep in mind, it's not always apples to apples in those conversations. So part of my talk with you today is to help educate where some of those things are that you can ask about when presented with just that number. Keep in mind, it is an estimate. There's nobody going to go out and make sound financial investments on just the estimate. The estimate's part of the equation. It is part of the decision. It should not be the only part of the decision. There's a lot of other factors included in that. So most hospitals have over 200. I think the last 4 or 5 that we've done, they average anywhere from 250 to 380 applications and contracts that needed to be dealt with as part of the decision. If it was mergers, acquisition, and or EMR replacement, in some cases, it's just a good due diligence of, hey, what is it costing us right now? You'd be surprised at how many IT contracts exist from a legacy standpoint that still have to be dealt with. As you're going forward, once you have your TCO, completing a monthly, quarterly variance tracking is absolutely mandatory. Otherwise, you've wasted your time. It's going to get off the track. It's going to get out of hand, and you're going to have to repeat this process, within a few years. So if you take the time either to invest in somebody to help you do it, or you invest your human resource power into getting it done yourself, make sure at the very end of it that you've got some kind of variance tracking to make sure you absorb the changes and identify those as you're going forward so you can make it a useful product. One of the things that, and this is kind of a no-brainer, especially with 200 people on the line, there's going to be a lot of people that say, duh, we get it. But I challenge you to look at really how much it does touch your organization. IT touches everything, right? And as far as the cost goes, it's often the reaction of what it touches and the impact of that can be a big driver of costs as much as it is just knowing what an application or a piece of hardware costs. You likely have more contracts associated than you realize. And know this, that I've been brought in of the couple hundred or so, we occasionally get brought in kind of in the middle or towards the end because it's just not going well, only to find out that they really haven't done a good diligence around all the contracts and all the downstream decisions that impact. So a lot of times backing up, renegotiating with vendors and things of this nature. One of the things that I tell everybody in a presentation like this that I can't tell you once you've started, it's too late. If you're thinking about a major enhancement decision to your HIS, your hospital, if you're contemplating a change, if you're even looking at, hey, look, we're going to sharpen our pencil and try to get, our operating cost associated with IT down a little bit more closer to industry standards. If your vendors get wind of that, if your vendor, and again, if there's vendors on this call, I'm just stating facts based on my experience. I'm not poking at any one vendors. Vendors live and die by what they sell, right? Their reputation and their profit margins, especially those that are publicly traded, they have to be able to make a profit. And there's a way to do that. One of those is, if you need their services and you don't have a choice, that reduces your leverage and negotiating once you've made your announcement. So if you're going to do any kind of a project, I would encourage you to, while you're doing your Q of E and other things that are going on, maybe for acquisitions and mergers, start with the IT stuff. Get a hold of the contract. Let somebody go through and see what contracts could potentially terminate right in the middle of your project. Put your back against the wall and you're paying 60% over the list price simply because you have to have it right now. All of those things are factors towards your cost of owning that. So again, these are not necessarily things for gathering the figures of the cost. These are things that impact your cost of ownership going through a transition like that. And it can happen right in the middle of operating. It doesn't have to necessarily be part of a large enterprise. It simply be somebody talking to a vendor saying, yeah, we just put in this vendor and now we've got this issue and you're the only one that can help us. So would you help us? Well, that's a salesman's dream, right? Absolutely, I'll help you. Let me get my quote pen and we'll see what we can do. So start in kind of a black box, in my opinion, situation. If you're going to do this, kind of keep it close to the vest until you may notice that there has to be a contract that's going to be sunsetting. I might go to that vendor without them having any other knowledge and simply say, look, we kind of like your product. We'd like to keep it, but it's kind of expensive. Could you give us about a 15% discount and maybe a year to year? And then if there's nothing else going on, usually the salesman from that vendor will say, absolutely, Barry, let's do that. Once you have that secured, then move forward with your project. Your leverage stays on your side versus the other side of the table. So again, this is just a kind of a Venn diagram explaining kind of what I said before. And that's, if you drew this 20 years ago, these circles would be outside of each other, barely touching. In today's world, it's IS touches everything in the hospital. Technology is touching everything, and it's all bringing information together. And with the push towards interoperability, that's only going to get bigger. And you just heard from Jason and Kathy about how a lot of data is being used. So it's a data world. So there's just no way that IT is not going to be impacted in there. So your cost of ownership, obviously, your cost of operating is going to go up as you get more with this. So it's good to know where you're starting so you can try to trend whether or not you're rising too fast or you're rising within the confines of your strategy, or if you're just completely outside your strategy and making some bad decisions from an IT standpoint. So these are obviously the typical parts of both your clinical system, non-clinical systems. I put interfaces. You can also probably draw a circle there now that interoperabilities and see how interoperability interacts with that well. But at the end, whatever you put in there, just draw a big giant circle around it, call it IT, and you've got it done. So TCO versus TCD, total cost of ownership, has been around quite a long time. TCD is something I'm introducing to you likely. The cost of ownership, development includes your typical development cost, security cost, and securing the operations. And this is some could be capital, it could be operational. Licensing and tooling, again, it's capital up front. You may have subscriptions for licensing, which are more operational, but running infrastructure, support, maintenance, incidents, all of these things that you're used to. A few that you may not be used to putting into your TCO, your audits, governance, decommissioning, and you can get estimates. You can talk to consultants like us and say, at the end of this engagement, what am I likely going to pay based on the vendors that I'm using for decommissioning these services? What's the out cost going to be? And sometimes you can actually get that negotiated in your contracts. Often vendors would like to leave that open. Interoperability, information blocking, that's currently kind of helps rein that in for us. It normalizes that a little better than it's been in the past. It was kind of the Wild West. So going out, when an EMR vendor or even a large HS like a PACS or something, they felt very comfortable charging numbers that were just ridiculous. They're going to have a tough time doing that going forward, based on rules associated with 21st century cures and information blocking. So TCD, the difference between the total cost of ownership and the total cost of decision is the total cost of decision really includes things that are not necessarily related to IT. And some of these come from experience, and some of these come from other people talking to me. The one up front is one that kind of surprised a particular system, that when after they made their decision, signed their contract, just to find out that some of their ACO participants said, well, if you're going to go that direction, the hospital across town, the university system is going to go this direction, and that's the direction we want to go. So we're going to pull out of the ACO and we're going to participate with them. So all of a sudden, there's a big drop in their ACO participation based on their technology decisions around a particular application. Contract payouts, additional vendors required to backfill. Another true story, right towards 3/4 way through the implementation, there was a project that somebody misaligned on a conversion, and it required a tremendous amount of outsourcing effort to help with the operation. So without giving away who it is or what's going on, there were additional skill sets needed on a daily basis to prep workflow for clinicians, simply because of something that was missed in the beginning related to the decision on what EMR to use, or in this case, an imaging system. And because of that, there was well up into the 6 figures additional cost that nobody planned on, simply because the clinicians could not do some additional workarounds themselves and take care of patients at the same rate. So therefore, a third party had to be brought in to do that. Nobody planned on that. It's something that during a TCO diligence or a TCD diligence would likely have come out. It's one of the things that we look at are the compatibilities between systems such as PAC systems, LIS systems, ERP systems. What's the conversion look like? What's the experience? You would want to do the diligence on those companies to ensure that there's some experience with that particular vendor, and ask for references. And so there's a whole process you go through to figure out what's the true cost of me deciding to go this direction, whether it's an enhancement to your current EMR, EHR, whether it's a replacement, or even if it's part of a merger, acquisition, flip, due diligence, or even an improvement process going on. You want to know what those things that are not necessarily tied to technology, how the cost may affect your system, just based on that decision. A lot of forced applications and compatibilities, and that's really could be part of the TCO, part of the TCD. Sometimes the politics associated with it's where it's going. It's not the technology that's incompatible. It's the human resources that's incompatible, and there may be additional cost associated. You may have some attrition because of that. Attrition is a true cost of the decision, and if you don't know what your attrition may be and you haven't dealt with that up front, then it could be a surprise cost to the operations of the organization, simply because you made an IT decision. And then the last thing on, it's kind of like an employment agreement. The last statement is, in anything deemed necessary by management, unique factors related to you. And again, this is the second time, I'll say it 2 more times likely before we're done. You're all different. The things that really make up your cost of decision beyond the IT are as unique as the way you operate in your communities. So sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's contracts, sometimes it's other things going around you from a regulatory standpoint that you may not be aware of. All of these kind of things can affect that total cost of decision. Okay. Polling question number 1. Go ahead, whoever's in charge of that.
The first question is, how is TCD different than TCO? Both are the same. A TCO gives you an exact cost with less than 1% variance. A TCD includes other factors outside IT. A TCO is for small systems, a TCD is for larger systems, or a TCO is less accurate than a TCD. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Barry.
Okay, so about 76% of you got it right. The 4%, that's kind of the tricky part. There's a lot of pieces that do crossover. If I could get it within a 1% variance, we'd start our own company and make $1 bazillion. Getting it to a 1% variance is likely impossible, but it brings up another comment, and that is you do want to plan on the estimate being a variance. If you're in, 7 to 10%, man, you're a superstar. If you're above 15%, then you're likely missing some steps and there's some misalignment in your estimate. I wouldn't necessarily trust all of it. So that 10 to 15 is usually, if you're putting a contingency on, hey, we're operating at this level, 10, within a certain percentage, not your total cost percentage, but percentage of what you estimated your cost to be, which is a little different. So, and I'll explain that when we get to the metrics and the benches that we use in terms of a percentage of your operating expenses compared to your total hospital expenses, that sort of thing. So, all right, polling question number 1, I can take control again. Not advancing for, there it goes. It's just slow to respond. So I'm gonna have to back up, my apologies. There we go. So let's talk just a little bit about your capital expenses that go into your TCO and TCD. The vendors obviously have a different models, and the reason they're kind of shotgunned out on this, I've kind of laid them out as close they are to what they typically like to do. For example, when you're looking at the upfront cost of a CapEx, front loaded, typically broken down to hardware, software implementation. Those are the big buckets. There's obviously things like interfaces and things like that may be put in there, but we consider that software. Epic is one of those that, look, all that's going to be baked in up front. Rarely would Epic talk to you about, a SaaS or subscription model, at least in the beginning. There is some conversations around that now, especially when it comes to Community Connect to other hospitals. Again, whole nother topic for discussion, but solidly one of those up front. Oracle, Cerner, the Cerner folks there in Kansas City, Lee Summit, same kind of way. Now, Community works with Cerner, again, depends on the products within there. Maybe there's a SaaS conversation around there if you want to, but typically with Cerner, it's an upfront, front loaded, you pay the implementation fees and then you have a maintenance fee going forward. Sitting on the fence is, Meditech traditionally was kind of a front load. Now with Meditech Expanse, it's in the Google Cloud. It's kind of built for a little bit of a SaaS in there, so that you're not paying quite as much up front, in some cases very little, and then it's an operation fees going forward. But again, from owning that over 10-year period, you're probably going to want something in your contract that renegotiates. Otherwise, you wind up paying for that capital cost twice in, say, a 7-year or 10-year agreement, and you don't want to do that. So there's even some things you have to watch out for there if you're going through EMR selection. CPSI kind of, they're publicly traded, very small, decent market share, focused on critical access and less than 100 beds. They have some above that. They have a few, but mostly that's their space, and they're really accommodating. They're out of Mobile, Alabama. Very, very Southern charm approach, and hey, whatever you need, we'll try to help you do. And so they're kind of sitting on the fence. And then down here on the bottom third of this, the rev share, that's really, hey, look, we'll get our money based on what your collection. So that's Athena, and then we've seen some other models start to drift towards that. Some piloting of that certainly works kind of like your outsourced rev cycle management companies, but you see some EMRs and other vendors that are moving towards that, and we'll take a percentage of your revenue, or take a percentage of whatever service that we're providing. In that case, they're taking a percentage of revenue, net revenue for that. There's no or little, very little, almost negligent upfront hardware cost, software implementation cost. Once the system goes live, you start paying a maintenance fee that's associated to what you're collecting, and that's how you pay for it. Again, the honeymoon is those first few years where you would have to have, purchased capital equipment and services and depreciated those. But by the time you get to the end of that contract, all that stuff would have been fully depreciated, been paid for, and then you were just strictly down to a very small percentage maintenance comparable. But in this case, you're going to go forward with that fee that still includes all that. So again, make sure in your contracts, if you're one of these SaaS models or rev share models, that you're doing some negotiating, that you get a chance to go back to the table and adjust some of that later on. So otherwise, if you got the capital money, I certainly recommend putting the capital into it up front, depreciating it, moving on. So, all right, so your operational, be careful of things like dynamic growth costs, where the contract may say, here's the operating expense going forward, but here's the fees, maintenance fees going forward, but we may choose to, as we upgrade our product, we'll likely increase your fees. Having that open-ended is just a dangerous thing, and I've seen some hospitals really get hurt over long periods of time, leaving that wide open. And so negotiate that down. Certainly, you don't want to pay for anything that's regulatory related. They've gotten used to that, but I wouldn't pay for it if their product isn't built enough for me, to accept it. If they're still under development, then I should get that as it comes up, right? Now, I'm not talking about huge new technology advances. So if the world's never heard of virtualization and they put virtualization in, there's probably a value to that. But even then, I would kind of cap some of those costs. I would keep those as a percentage of the total maintenance, so they just could get crazy. Otherwise, your cost of ownership is going to go out the roof as technology increases. They have to have a way to make money. It's a margin thing. It should be managed as opposed to just kind of the Wild West. Your standard stuff that we're all used to, your break, fix, service support, these are all your maintenance costs, upgrades, and enhancements. They will typically put those in the maintenance fee, and it's as they discover things that are broken and they fix those, they're not going to charge you for those. But what they want to charge you for is, hey, look, there's this new telemedicine as a part of the public health emergency that's going to allow us to charge CPT code, and we want to charge you to do that. Well, I would negotiate a contract that says, no, that's just a part of you keeping it up. Microsoft, every time you get a Microsoft Word has a new version, there's some cost associated, but it's not reinstalling Microsoft. There's some expectations that they're going to keep up with the time. So make sure you find out what their expectations are and align those with your strategy and your operating expenses. Other your standard operating costs, your staffing, subscriptions, training, etc. Those are all in your OpEx, obviously. Other support costs, new interoperability fees, those should be somewhat, manageable these days. Before, that was the Wild West again. Today, under the information blocking, there's a cost plus model where vendors can really, it's their direct cost associated plus a reasonable profit margin. So they'd have somebody like PYA do evaluation on what is, or what is a reasonable profit margin for this. They should be charging that for these, as opposed to, well, it's 21,000, each way directional for interface. Can't be that anymore. So if you're still experiencing that, call me. We need to talk, because they can't be doing that anymore. Other support costs, again, we talked about the interoperability fee, consulting, legal fees, and they could be associated to issue resolution, mitigation, could be part of the ongoing expense of just keeping the contract. If you have an outsourced part of this with a third party, even services or hardware, software, could be some contractual SLAs that you want to look at on a regular basis. Maybe you don't have the staff inside. Whatever those fees associated, that's part of the cost of owning that system. It comes with it. It's the maintenance. Just like buying a big house, you have to do the yard, spray the yard, clean off the siding every now and then. Those are all costs associated to owning. So don't forget those. Polling question number 2.
Thank you. The second question is, what is typically not part of CapEx? Initial hardware, initial training, license fees, implementation travel costs, or consulting fees related to EMR selection? Remember, you must fill out the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Barry.
All right, thank you. Let's see what we got. Okay, well, we got consulting fees related to EMR selection, 46%. That's strange. The one thing is definitely not part of CapEx, and really this is a gap, kind of rule. Training cannot be capitalized. So even though there's a huge number associated with training on installing your EMR as part of a project, that training under GAAP rules really cannot be capitalized. However, believe it or not, if you pay a consultant as part of that capital project, if you start with selection, negotiations under the same GAAP rules, you can probably capitalize that. It's part of the implementation or install of that project. It started with the diligence and selection of your current. It is part, if you make it part of that capital project. So interesting enough, but training, and somebody feel free to phone in or correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain I've been taught by more than one accountant that you cannot capitalize that training. You just can't do it. And I've run into a lot of situations where we were doing diligence or trying to come up with TCOs or in the middle of a project, and there's this huge training number. Boy, it'd be nice to put that in a capital project, not hit the operational of the hospital, but unfortunately it hits the operational. The other thing I'll add in there that wasn't necessarily part of that question, it's just something that popped in my mind as you guys were taking the 36 to answer it. We talked about total cost of decision and the fact that you might have to bring in, augmented staffing to help with clinical workflows post whatever decision you're making, whether it's mergers, acquisitions, and there's a capital project associated with that, or if it's a true EMR, replacement or enhancement, which a lot of capital dollars go into. And if you have, and that project is over, it's live, but you had to bring staff back in. I've had people want to capitalize that. And the reality is, no, that's those are operational fees as well. Those people that are helping the clinical workflow because of the IT decision are not part of the capital decision. It's an operational fee that hits the bottom line. Again, one of the reasons you want to work that stuff out ahead of time to truly know what your operational impact is going to be, because you're trying to make other decisions downstream, for the next few years, operationally and plan and strategy, and knowing the IT impact of that just from making the decision is extremely important. All right, make sure we get this done in the right amount of time. So we're on to benching metrics. I get this more than anything else. Barry, what's a good benching? For IT healthcare, 10, 15 years ago, it was Dorenfest. It was Shelby Dorenfest. And Shelley used to put this stuff out all the time. Great bit. And HIMSS bought the Healthcare Information Management Systems Society, kind of bought Shelley's business. He's now over in China working with them on healthcare EMR selections and systems and contracting. But that information still exists. A lot of it you have to pay for. You'll notice that mine's 2019. You could probably get 2022 if you wanted to pay money to Gartner or HIMSS or some others that are out there. This comes from Computer Economics, and I've used them in the past. They do a lot of different things across different industries, and I like that. Gartner does as well. Gartner's very proud of theirs. If you want to write a check for that, what you're going to find out, it's not going to differ very much from this, and it really hasn't changed. The last significant change to some of these costs, whether it's either as a percentage of revenue or percentage of expenses, it changed between 2011 and 2015. We've seen a big, probably 2.5 point jump, simply because of meaningful use, right? Government threw $30 billion out there. We went for our pieces of it. And because of that, we installed more systems, we connected more systems, and the cost of purchasing and operating those, it jumped about 2.5 points industry-wide. So since then, it's kind of normalized, and we can talk about and there's really two bench metrics that I typically work with. One is the percentage of revenue, and this is more of a sales approach. If I'm the vendor, I kind of like this one. It allows me to show you that my product is not as expensive as the other folks, sort of thing. And for healthcare, that percentage of revenue runs in that 3 to 6%. Okay. Strangely enough, it's going to be very close to the IT expenses as well. The bench that I most often talk about, because this is really the cost of owning or operating the system, it fits better in that as opposed to just the purchase of the system. And that is your percentage of total IT expenses related to your total hospital expenses. So hold your cheese sandwich for a second, put down your soup, focus for just 1 second here. If you don't know this, if this is something that is not sitting on a report, if your CIO doesn't know this, if your CTO doesn't know this, if you're a smaller organization and your IT director isn't plugged into this and you guys aren't talking about this, you're missing something. You should know this. What is your total IT expense cost as a ratio to your total hospital expense? it helps you understand, are we getting the value for the money we're putting into IT? Are we putting way more in? Are we grabbing everything that's glitzy, but we're not getting a return? It's costing us more to run it than it really should be. And that could also be professional services staffing or even consulting services involved. So the industry, the smaller percentile, and in that 25th percentile, okay, that is a lot of your critical access hospitals, small hospitals, and others to get that. Now, Matthew's telling, I got a good time check from Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. I've got till 1 o'clock, so we've got plenty of time. I want to leave some time for, I'm hoping you're going to ask questions. Just bombard me with questions. But that 25%, they're smaller. If you're over 100-bed hospital or something like that, and you're running at 4.5%, 5%, you're running within the industry average, right? That's about where everybody's at. Now it's going to vary a little bit based on the EMR. So for those industry averages all the way down to that 25th percentile, you're going to see them running CPSI. It's Allscripts Paragon version, the old McKesson Paragon. You're going to see them running maybe Athena and some other places. They're not going to be the Epics and the Cerners. I'm just telling you. If you're running Epic or Cerner at 4.5% or 5%, man, you're phenomenal. You're doing a great job if you can stomach that. When you get up to the 75th percentile and beyond, that's where you're going to see, the Allscripts Sunrise. You're going to see Cerner. You're going to see Epic, and even in the Epic world, it's not going to scare me to death if you told me, Barry, I'm running 7%. Trying to support Epic. That's about it. Epic's an expensive system to buy. It's an expensive system to run. Even trying to get someone Epic certified, if you have someone leave who's Epic certified, has a huge expense associated with it, right? And it's now part of your operational expenses. So because it's essentially training, you put that through the operational budget. So it's an expensive system. Cerner's a fairly expensive system if you're not running Community Works. Community Works is going to be back in that 4.5% to 5% range. So I challenge you, encourage you. And CFOs have different ways to do this. For example, I have some CFOs, if you want to include some of your HIM numbers and telecom numbers, marketing and stuff like that, then you're obviously going to be outside of this. And when you're looking at this from an industry standpoint, we typically carve out telecom. Okay, we carve out, in some instances, HIM falls under the IT budget places. We'll pull that out because we're not really talking about the human resources side. Now, the IT systems related, your release of information, all the connectivity pieces, that's absolutely part of your IT, but not the human resources part of HIM, and not the telecommunication pieces as well. So those are typically carved out. And then with that, you've got these numbers. So this is a pretty good bench. And if you come back and told me, hey, Barry, I'm running Cerner, Millennium, and we did our numbers, we carved out all the telecom stuff, we carved out any kind of HIM, and we think we've got everything, and we're running about 6%. Okay, you're probably operating within a decent operating margin with your EMR or your full HIS. If you came back and said, Barry, we're running 9%, I'd say, whoa, there's a project there. I mean, you could literally turn things around with a nice project. There's probably some efficiencies. There's some contracts that need to be renegotiated. You may have something called shelfware, and that is, well, we bought Palo Alto from a security standpoint, but it was so complicated, it's sitting on the shelf. Okay, we'll call these guys and see if we can get something for what we're paying monthly, or let's just stop paying. Let's negotiate. Say, look, we got to do something different. So if you're approaching that 8-9%, yeah, there's something wrong. You need to have it looked at. Somebody like myself or others who do what I do would want to come in there and take a look at that. So Epic and Cerner, in a lot of cases, tend to run a couple of points. I've seen a few that are working very well. Once you get through the diligence, they're running very smoothly, but they could be as much as 3 points higher than that 4.5. But they're likely going to be your larger academic medical centers, your huge IDNs and things like that, that would argue that they're getting the value from it. They're getting a lot of other things that are going in. So, and again, that's that. This is the third time I'll say it. I'll say it one more time. You're all different. Okay, so there's no universal stamp on this that says, here's the recipe to getting this right. Going through the process, doing your homework, going through the diligence, having the conversations, learning what's unique about you as it relates to the EMR, the HIS is different than someone else, is a big part of truly understanding what your cost of ownership is. Now, you may not need this, so I'll take a moment before we move on from the metrics and we talk about some strategy stuff. There's situations to where getting close is good enough. I mentioned that there were 3, and then I had a couple more reasons for looking at your TCO, and certainly if you're going through a decision process, including your TCD. But you may be going through a large merger and acquisition and simply do the benching. So if you started the process and you're fairly certain that everything that you've captured in the cost, is, or everything that you've captured that you can see without doing a whole lot of diligence is there, and you're running a 5%, 6%, okay, expense margin, then going through the process of a full due diligence may not be necessary, because you're going to clean up things after the acquisition, after the merger, or after the separation, those sort of things. Fix my ear there. So you may choose not to go through that. But if that's not clear to you, if you start down the questioning, if you start asking for artifacts that show proper monitoring and maintenance of cost associated, and you're going into an acquisition, or even if the CFO, if you and your CIO or CTO are sitting down and you're trying to get your hands around some of these, and it's not just readily available, we're having to do a whole lot of homework to bring things to the table, then you may want to go through a project, to look at your true TCO. And certainly if you're going to do a EMR replacement, or something that's a large enhancement, large packs change out or something like that, I would recommend a TCO with TCD. I would do those to truly, it's going to help in your negotiations. And again, remember, extremely important, I wouldn't let that out of the bag until I had done some of that diligence, until I've identified the contracts that may be flipping in the middle of that, until I've identified the interfaces, interoperability, and I would keep that in a black box. Once I have that under control, then I would announce, okay, we're going to go through this project. You're going to find the result to be vastly different than someone who simply says to the world, we're going to replace our EMR. We want to start talking to vendors, okay? Start talking to vendors behind the scenes first to get some of these things aligned, and then make your announcement. All right, so with benching, again, you can reach out on your own. They cost some money. Some of these are, if you're willing to take 19 and 20 numbers, you can get a lot of this like I did without having to pay an exorbitant amount of money. But these are pretty solid. Again, there may be those that argue with me that say we run here, we run here. I get it. Everybody's a little different, but these are pretty solid numbers, and kind of have been consistent for a while. 2-point jump around 11 and 12 to 15. So our best approach and a strategy, okay? For one, the existing TCO calculation, I get calls or emails or even texts from friends that say, we're getting ready to do this project, Barry. And in some cases, they'll say, will you help us? But there's a lot of times they just say, where do we start? Happy to give that away, giving it away right here, right now. One of the places I tell anybody is starts with your accounts payable. Chances are you're not receiving any type of IT service, be it a direct technology, hardware, support, anything, for free. Somebody's charging you for that. When we did the at Ochsner, Chris Belmont was a CIO at that time, and we sit down in the beginning of that, taking Ochsner from OCW, Ochsner Clinical Workstation, which was a homegrown system, phenomenal, even certified stage 1 meaningful use, started out by Dr. Lynn Witherspoon, who was the CIO prior to Chris. We needed to know, what is our current true cost of IT and HIS in the hospital, because we're going to start comparing to what's the delta between what we're doing now. We knew we were going to pay more for Epic. We knew that, but what's the true delta? The board of directors, they wanted to know, how much more are we paying? That was a 9 hospital, or 7, and then he wound up buying 2 more at the time. So it wound up being a 9 hospital decision, right, to move from what we were doing over to Epic, and took us about 6 months to do that. Okay, took about 6 months to go through it. Where did we start? We started with accounts payable. We went through the entire accounts payable for at least, I think, 2 to 3 years. And we had a team of folks, and we identified every charge as it was IT. And then we started categorizing it. Was it IT hardware support, even depreciation? We were able to show all that stuff. Now, if you're a single entity, if you're a 1 hospital system, 2 hospital system, about 30 days is what you're going to need, in my opinion, to do something very similar. We did it in about 3 weeks, to be honest with you, for a 90-bed hospital not too long ago in Mississippi. Needed same type of situation they needed to know, and we were able to do that in about 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks. But typically, I would give yourself 90 days to be safe, especially if you're going to do it yourself. If you're going to outsource it to somebody, you can get it done faster, but just like, buying a loaf of bread at the grocery store right when you need it, because it's next to the pier at the marina. You may pay a little bit of premium for that to get it right then. But you should be able to do these things yourself if you want. If so, give yourself 90 days. Start with your accounts payable. Look for hidden costs, okay? And places where you find those, ancillary has a lot of hidden costs, connectivity pieces, release of information pieces, augmented staff pieces. And we have something called shadow IT. That's part of owning your IT. Most of us are used to that. We brought it as internal auditors 10, 15, 20 years ago. We brought that term to the industry, shadow IT. What is shadow IT? A PACS administrator is shadow IT. They work in radiology. They basically help manage your PACS, but it's part of your technology footprint. It's part of the cost of owning that technology. It really belongs in that IT budget because you may need more than one PACS administrator at some point. Same thing within lab. You have we call them super users. They've evolved to this person. Granted, in a pinch, they could probably go out there and handle the Chem 7 machine and analyzers and things like that in the schedule. But typically, their day is spent working with the IT, the reports, the interfaces, quality assurance, safety, all these kind of things. They're part of the IT footprint. They're shadow IT. They may not necessarily report to your IT department, but they're part of your IT footprint. Do not forget those. You may be doing things outside of IT with public health initiatives, trying to grow your ACO under the relaxed start. There's some things that we can do to offer assistance to clinics and practices to be on our EMR. Well, those are costs of owning that, the cost associated. Sometimes it can be capitalized as part of a capital initiative, but a lot of times it's some of the operational, especially the support piece of it. If you're going to charge X dollars per physician going forward per month to be on your instance of whatever Epic or Meditech or Cerner, then those are costs that you have to consider. So make sure you bring those into your total cost of ownership. It's part of it. Non-technology infrastructure. So a lot of that is the buildings, the racks, the maintenance. There's all kind of things that are not necessarily technically related, but they had to be put in place in order to hold the technology, to support the technology. It could be power. It could be running power across the street, fiber. So it's things that are not necessarily related to server, hardware, software, but without them, you're not going to achieve your goal. Well, that's part of the cost. In a lot of cases, it can be capitalized, but it should be considered as what it costs to own that. That's the true total cost. So things that are kind of new in the total cost of decision. Obviously, it's the TCO plus the organizational domain impact. What's the impact to the organization footprint with this decision? We mentioned earlier the ACO change, which is kind of a surprise for some people. You may have contractual pieces that you could be violating a contract by doing certain things from a maintenance standpoint. So knowing that early, and that there's a penalty to get out early. One of the toughest conversations that I had with any board of trustees was for a Michigan hospital in an IT outsourcing situation, to where the outsourcing was $1 million fine or penalty, right? Not a fine, but a penalty. To get out early was $1 million. And we had shown them, several spreadsheets where write the check for the million, write it as soon as you can, because bringing it in-house, all these things, you're going to be better off within about 3 months. You're going to already moving towards the black in 3 months. But just writing $1 million check was getting a lot of people nervous. Took a while to convince them, but it's part of that decision, total cost of decision. It balanced out because of the fee change. And this was a place that was running around 9, 10, even 11% of their total their total hospital expenses dedicated to IT from an outsourcing arrangement. Was not a very good arrangement at all. Managed to get it flipped around. Hospital went from red to black within about 18 months. So they were very pleased. But just identifying that through the diligence was part of the approach, right? Build a true staffing model based on the EMR. The way you support, Paragon, Allscripts Paragon, formerly Meditech Paragon, vastly different than the way you support Meditech Expanse. Meditech Expanse, vastly different than what you support for Meditech Client Server Release 6, vastly different than what you do for Cerner Millennium, which is vastly different than what you do for Cerner Community Works. All of that vastly different for what you're going to do for Epic. So make sure, as you're figuring out your go forward operating costs, that it really is kind of tilted toward your situation, because you may have combinations. You may have clinics running Athena, You may have clinics running Community Connect, moving over to Athena, or vice versa. You may have a hospital that acquired running Meditech, but yet you're running Cerner Millennium. All of those come into factor as to what should we plan on the future operating expenses be? What are we thinking over the next 5-7 years? By the way, if somebody offers you a 10-year TCO, it's usually the vendor because it makes them look better than the other guys. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. Don't sign a contract for 10 years. 7 years is pushing it for me, but most vendors, that's about as low as they'll go. If the market is fairly aggressive, sometimes they'll do a 5 with some renewal conversations in there and some static stuff that stays. But build that plan for interoperability. It's a lot easier now with the information blocking to plan on the interoperability cost. So you should build that in as kind of a more static factor going forward based on what you want to do with interoperability, whether it's with your public health or your HIE or just bringing Internet of Things devices into the equation. You should be able to do a little bit more predictable on what those costs are going to be, but make sure you capture those in if you're looking at future cost of ownership. And then plan for the sunset at the very tail end of your TCO. Don't assume that you're going to automatically negotiate with this vendor. And you might wind up in a situation where you have to negotiate out early. Find out what those costs are going to be. Get those in writing if you can. Get those capped if you can. Good negotiating, you can, especially if the vendor's really interested in keeping you in the market. Now, Epic's not going to be there. Epic rarely negotiates with anybody. But they have recently, especially as they're trying to move into more the middle market with their Community Connect, working with other hospitals, they have starting to lighten up a little bit on some of that stuff. But find out what the end's going to be. If you had to swap that, what is the sunset cost going to be? And even within staying within that same vendor, if they do a massive technology change or they have purchased, perfect example, Allscripts purchased McKesson, right? Oracle bought Cerner. Okay, the Oracle Cerner one, again, probably a whole nother discussion, but Allscripts and McKesson's fairly simple. Allscripts bought McKesson for what? One good reason: the market share. When they stop supporting Paragon, or eventually you're going to want to go to Sunrise. Well, find out what that's going to be. If you're going to stay with Allscripts, or there's going to be a cost of decision there, get that early as you start to renew, your relationship with them. Find out what that cost is going to be if you had to sunset, if you went to somebody else. There's likely language in the contract that supports one way or the other. So we are getting up to just a few minutes to the end. The best approach strategy, again, do your own work. I put a graph out there. It's kind of small. It's kind of hard to read. I pulled 3 from a study that was done by HIMSS article called "A Unique Approach to Business Analytics." And again, I'm not going to go through this. It's just to show you that even though there's some similarities, the cost difference between those two, that one entity is not going to be the same just because they're running the same EMR. There's a lot of things that come into the cost of ownership factor that's just unique to you. So do your homework, do your own homework, or have somebody help you with that. Give yourself at least 90 days. And then once you've got a good, accurate TCO or TCD, it's going to be easier to do the next time. Don't let it sit for 5 years. Do it every few years, true it up, keep it going. You'll thank me for that. Last polling question, then I think we're done.
Thank you. The third question is, what are good points when calculating a total cost of decision? Review IT staffing to include shadow and contractors. Identify any contracts that are close to renewal. Consider non-IT costs. Assess existing accounts payable and identify IT-related fees, or all of the above. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Barry.
Here we go. That's what we're looking at. 93%, all the above. Absolutely. Reviewing your staff, including shadow contractors, absolutely necessary. Identify any contracts that are close to renewal. That's going to help you, especially if you're trying to predict operating costs as a TCO going forward. Consider all your non-IT costs, that's the TCD, and assess the existing accounts payable. That's a good project to go through, even if you're not looking for the detail that we've talked about in this presentation. Just going through your AP every now and then and pulling out all of those IT costs It's going to help you with identifying things that may be shelfware that's inefficient. It's a good project to go through, and it's one that you can do yourself if you have the time. So how we can help? If you've heard me say, I've got a lot of experience. PYA, we've got a lot of experience in working with all types of entities, whether it's a capital investment firm that's doing it for diligence, if it's a hospital trying to get on the right track, mergers, acquisitions, and likely the most common one is probably going through an EMR selection process, and having to negotiate contracts, knowing where they should be in that negotiations. Any of those things you need help with, we're happy to help. We're always here to help. We've enjoyed being part of this symposium, and I will make myself available for questions after the fact if we need to. So with that, I thank you again for your time and your attention, and look forward to hearing from anyone who has further follow-up.
Thank you, Barry. We now have a 15-minute break before Angie Caldwell and John Kersner present Understanding the Business Case for Using Value-Based Exceptions. We will be back at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time.